The call came the way the worst ones always did not. With warning, not with buildup. Just a sound that pulled Dorothy Dixon out of sleep as cleanly as a hand closing around her wrist. She was 74 years old and a light sleeper. Had been since her third year of nursing when she had learned that the body adjusts to the rhythms it is asked to keep, and her body had spent 30 years keeping the rhythms of a hospital emergency room. The graveyard shift, the 3 to 11, the double shifts on holidays when the younger nurses called in sick, and the ER filled up with the particular category of human damage that the holidays seemed to produce with reliable efficiency. She had been retired for 9 years. Her body had not entirely gotten the message. What she heard was not the sound of the hospital, not the overhead page, not the rolling squeak of a crash cart, not the particular compressed urgency of boots on linoleum that meant something had gone bad somewhere down the hall. What she heard was a sound from outside the front of the laundromat, a dragging sound, then a thud that was too heavy to be a branch and too deliberate to be an animal, and then a silence of a specific quality, the silence of something or someone that had stopped moving and was not going to start again on its own. Dorothy Dixon sat up in the cot she kept in the back room of Millhaven Wash and Fold, which was what she called the laundromat she had owned and operated for 11 years in what used to be a hardware store on the south end of Clement Street. The cot was a practical matter, not a sentimental one. The boiler that served the machine sometimes needed attention in the night, and the drive from her house on Garfield Avenue was 8 minutes. She did not always want to spend at 2 in the morning. The cot had a decent mattress and a wool blanket and a pillow that was older than some of the doctors she had trained under, and it served its purpose. She put her feet on the floor. 61 years of muscle memory. She did not pause, did not deliberate, did not do the thing that the safety seminars would have told her to do, which was to call 911 and wait. She pulled on her robe and her shoes, and she walked to the front of the shop and unlocked the door. The man on the threshold was large. That was the first thing, and in certain kinds of situations, the first thing is the only thing that registers with any precision. Later the details arrive, the context assembles itself, but in the first second there is only large. He was on his side on the concrete of the front step, one arm extended, the other folded under him, and he was wearing a leather vest over a dark thermal shirt. And the shirt was wet in a way that had nothing to do with the November rain that had been falling on and off since 9 o'clock. Dorothy Dixon had seen a great deal of blood in 30 years of emergency nursing. She had seen it in volumes that most people spent their entire lives never encountering, and she had developed a particular relationship with it that long exposure creates, not indifference, nothing so clean as that, but a functional detachment. The ability to register what the blood indicated without being arrested by what the blood looked like. What the blood indicated here was a wound on the left lateral torso below the ribs. Entry point consistent with a blade. Not a bullet, the pattern was different. She had known both. He was breathing, shallow but regular. His color was poor in the flat yellow light from the street lamp, but not the color of someone whose pressure had already failed. She went back inside, got the kit she kept under the counter. The same kind of kit a nurse with 30 years and 2 grown children and a lifetime of being the person people called kept somewhere accessible. And she came back out and knelt beside him on the wet concrete without any particular consideration for her knees, which objected quietly and were ignored. His eyes opened when she pressed the first compress to the wound. They were dark eyes, gray at the edges in the lamplight, and they focused on her with the specific quality of focus that a person achieves when pain is the only available anchor to consciousness. "You a nurse?" His voice came out low and scraped. "Was," Dorothy said. She kept her hands where they were. "Don't move." "Not planning on it. I need to get you inside. Can you help me?" A pause in which she watched him assess this question honestly. He could help her some. Between his some and her 30 years of moving bodies that did not want to be moved, they got him through the door and onto the bench along the wall between the second and third row of washers, which was the longest flat surface available, and which put him close to the electrical outlet she needed, and far enough from the front windows that the light inside would not be visible from the street as anything other than the shop's usual overnight minimum. Dorothy locked the front door. She did not call 911. She would think about why she made that choice later in the way that she thought about most of the significant decisions of her life after the fact when the urgency had passed and the meaning was available. What she thought when she thought about it was, this 30 years in emergency medicine had taught her to read the landscape of a situation before she decided how to map it. And the landscape of the situation had features she wanted to understand before she introduced new variables. One of those features was the patch on the back of the leather vest. She had seen it when she moved him a stylized set of scales above the words Iron Verdict MC and below that Ohio. She knew the name. Millhaven was not a large town, and the Iron Verdict had been part of its landscape for going on 25 years. She got to work. The wound was a clean entry approximately 3 inches long left lateral wall below the fifth rib, deep enough to cause significant bleeding, not deep enough she believed, and she was being precise about what she believed and did not believe to have reached the lung or the liver. She irrigated it with saline from the bottle she kept in the kit. For this purpose, packed it with clean gauze, applied pressure, and did all of this with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had done harder things under worse conditions. He watched her work. He did not speak again for a while, which she took as a good sign. A man in shock talked too much or not at all. And the quality of his silence was the silence of someone conserving energy rather than losing it. After 15 minutes, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. "You're going to need stitches," she said. "I can do them, but I'd rather you went to an ER. No hospital." She had expected this. "All right, I have a suture kit. It'll hurt. I've had worse." "I believe you." She looked at his face for the first time with the specific attention she used for faces, the assessment she had done 10,000 times, looking for the signs that mattered. Pupils even, color improving, jaw set but not trembling. He was going to be all right, which was more than she could have said with confidence 20 minutes ago. "What's your name?" "Blaze." "That your given name." Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. Nathan Cross. Dorothy Dixon." She stood up her knees, objecting again and being ignored again. "Mr. Cross, I'm going to make coffee. You are going to lie still and not bleed on my bench any more than you already have, and then I'm going to come back and sew you up. Do we understand each other?" He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression she would think about later. A quality of assessment, of recalibration, as if he had arrived at this moment with certain expectations about how it would go, and those expectations were being systematically revised. "Yes, ma'am," Nathan Cross said. Dorothy Dixon went to make coffee. She made it strong the way she had made it since her nursing days, and she stood at the small counter in the back room while it brewed and looked at the framed photograph on the shelf above the coffee maker. Robert Dixon, 20 years ago, standing in front of the truck he had driven for Midwest Aggregate for 15 years before his knees gave out and he took the shop floor job at the tool and die place on Route 7. He was wearing his work shirt faded blue, and he was squinting into the sun the way he always had. He had refused to buy sunglasses on the grounds that they were an unnecessary expense, which had been both maddening and deeply characteristic. And he was not quite smiling, but the line of his mouth had the shape of a man who was about to. He had been dead 5 years. The missing of him was not sharp anymore, not the way it had been in the first year when she had reached for him in the night and found only the cool expanse of sheets on his side of the bed. It had become something rounder, denser, a permanent presence of a particular weight. The kind of grief that does not go away, but eventually becomes load-bearing, something you build the rest of your life on, rather than something that interrupts it. She poured 2 cups and carried them back out to the front. Nathan Cross had not moved. He had, she saw, turned his head to look at the room. The rows of machines, the folding tables, the bulletin board by the door, with its clusters of local notices, and the laminated card that said, "Wash, $2, dry, $1.75. Change machine and back with the expression of a man taking inventory of a place. She set 1 cup on the folding table nearest him. He looked at it. "Can you sit up enough to drink it?" "Yeah." He did it carefully with the controlled movement of a man who has learned precisely what his body will and will not do in a given state of damage. She noted the economy of it, no wasted motion, no performance of stoicism, just the straightforward management of a physical situation. She pulled a folding chair close and sat down and wrapped her hands around her own cup and looked at him. Who did it? She asked. Doesn't matter. It matters if they're coming back. He considered that. They're not. They got what they came for. This was a message, not a job. She nodded. She had heard that language before too, not from her patients, not in 30 years of emergency nursing in Youngstown, but from the things they had said in the minutes before the forms arrived and the professional distance closed back in. The language of people who lived in a world with a different grammar from the one she had grown up speaking. Are you going to tell me I should have called the police? He asked. No, Dorothy said. I'm going to tell you that if you develop a fever or the pain gets significantly worse, I need you to reconsider the hospital. Infection is how people die from wounds like this, not the wound itself. Are you allergic to anything? Penicillin. Good to know. She set down her cup. Let's get those stitches done. She did 12 stitches. He bore them without noise, which she registered with professional approbation. When she was done, she taped a clean dressing over the site and told him not to move the arm on that side more than necessary for at least 48 hours. You do this often? He asked. Stitch up strangers at 2 in the morning in my laundromat now. She began putting the kit back together. But I spent 30 years in an ER in Youngstown, so the skill set transfers. Youngstown. He said the name the way people from this part of Ohio said it, with the particular flatness of a word that carries too much history to be spoken with inflection. I know Youngstown. Most people around here do. She snapped the kit closed. You can stay until morning. The cot in the back room is not luxurious, but it's clean. If you try to leave before 6 o'clock, I will be annoyed. He looked at her with that expression again. The one she was starting to understand was his version of surprise, which was apparently a very small version. Yes, ma'am. Dorothy, I stopped being ma'am when I retired. She picked up the kit and stood. Get some sleep, Mr. Cross. You lost more blood than you think. She went back to the cot in the back room and lay down and looked at the ceiling and listened to the rain on the flat roof and thought about what she had done and why, and arrived at the same conclusion she had arrived at 20 years ago and 40 years ago, and on every occasion in her life when she had made the choice that her body made before her mind caught up. Some things you do because you are the person who can, not because you have weighed the consequences and found them acceptable, not because you have considered the alternatives, simply because the thing is in front of you and you have the hands for it, and the choice not to use them is a kind of choice that she had never, not once in 74 years, been able to make. Robert had understood this about her, had loved her for it, and been driven half crazy by it in equal measure. She closed her eyes. In 3 rows up from where she lay, Nathan Cross lay on the bench between the second and third washers, looking at the ceiling of Millhaven Wash and Fold, and breathed steadily and did not die, which was all things considered a good outcome for a Tuesday night in November. The morning came gray and specific, the way Ohio November mornings came. The light arriving not in a surge, but in a gradual replacement of dark, with something only slightly less dark. The sky the color of old iron, the street outside wet and quiet in the hour before the first cars began. Dorothy was up at 5:30. She made more coffee and opened the back room and brought a cup to Nathan Cross, who was awake and sitting up on the bench with the careful posture of a man taking stock of damage. How do you feel? She asked. Like I got stabbed. That's accurate. She set the cup on the folding table. Fever. He shook his head. Pain level on a scale of 1 to 10. He thought about this with more seriousness than most people gave to the question. 5, maybe 6 when I breathe deep. That's acceptable for 12 hours post. She sat down in the folding chair. Did you sleep? Some. Hungry. A pause. Something passed across his face, a small recalibration, as if the question had arrived in a register he had not prepared for. Yeah. She had eggs and bread in the back room, which she kept because the cot was not her only concession to practicality, and she made scrambled eggs on the hot plate and brought them out on the folding table, and they ate together in the gray morning light, with the washers silent around them and the street outside beginning slowly to wake up. He ate the way men ate when they had not eaten in a while, and were not going to comment on it with focus and without waste. She noted this. She noted most things. You live here? He asked, gesturing at the back room. I have a house on Garfield. I keep a cot here for when the boiler acts up. She ate a forkful of egg. How long has Iron Verdict been in Millhaven? 23 years. He looked at her. You know the club. I know of the club. There's a difference. She set down her fork. My husband used to say there were two kinds of knowing. The kind where you've heard things and the kind where you've sat down across from somebody and made up your own mind. I don't make up my mind ahead of time, Mr. Cross. Nathan. She picked up her fork again. You're welcome to stay another night. The offer of the cot was sincere, but I open the shop at 8 and I need to function like a normal laundromat when people come in with their clothes. I'll be out of your way. I'm not asking you to leave, I'm describing the logistics. She looked at him. There's a difference between those things too. He was quiet for a moment. Then you always this direct with people you patched up in the middle of the night. I'm always this direct with everyone, Dorothy said. Life is too short for the other kind. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not exactly, but the precursor to one, the relaxation of something that had been held tight. She recognized it. She had seen it in patients after the worst of it had passed, when the body finally sent the message that the danger was over and the defenses could come down a fraction. All right, Nathan Cross said. I'll stay. He stayed 3 days. She would not have predicted that. She would not have predicted most of what those 3 days produced, which was the particular kind of conversation that happens between two people who are not performing anything for each other. Not youth, not strength, not the careful social versions of themselves that most people deploy as a matter of habit. Nathan Cross was a taciturn man, and Dorothy Dixon had no patience for unnecessary words. And so the conversations that happened between them happened in short, precise exchanges that carried more weight than the word count suggested. She learned that he had grown up in Pennsylvania near Erie, that he had been with Iron Verdict for 26 years, that he had a sister in Pittsburgh he talked to twice a year, and a dog, a shepherd mix named Garrison, who was currently being looked after by a club member named Calvin. He learned that she had been a registered nurse from 1972 to 2002 Emergency Department, Youngstown City Hospital, that she and Robert Dixon had been married for 41 years before his heart attack 5 years ago, sudden and without warning, the kind of death the cardiologist called a widowmaker, with a clinical accuracy that she had always found both appropriate and brutal. That they had had 2 children, a son David in Columbus and a daughter Patricia in Seattle. That she had opened the laundromat because she had needed something to do with her hands after Robert died, and the house on Garfield had gotten too quiet. On the second night after the shop was closed and the last customer had taken their laundry and gone home, they sat at the folding table with coffee, and Dorothy said without particular preamble, Robert used to drive long haul before his knees gave out. Pennsylvania mostly. I-79 Route 30, the connector through Lawrence County. I know that road, Nathan said. I imagine you do. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He used to say Pennsylvania felt like a different country from Ohio. Same geography, different grammar. That's right. He was quiet for a moment. What was he like? She thought about the question with the seriousness she gave to all questions. Stubborn, funny, but he didn't know it. He'd say the most exact thing and not understand why it was funny. Good with his hands. He fixed things, not just around the house. He was the kind of man who, if he saw something broken and it was within his capacity to fix it, he fixed it. It didn't matter if it was his problem or not. Rare, Nathan said. Yes? Dorothy looked at her coffee cup. He would have been very interested in what you do. He didn't have a romantic idea about it. He was too practical for that. But he was interested in how people built their own systems of loyalty and obligation. He thought most institutions were built to protect themselves, not the people in them. What kind of questions would he have asked? The kind that sound simple and aren't. She looked up. He would have asked what you do when the club is wrong. Nathan Cross held her gaze. You answer it honestly or you leave, he said. Those are the only 2 choices that mean anything. Dorothy nodded slowly. That's what he would have said too. The third morning she came out at 5:30 to find Nathan standing in front of the shelf where she kept the framed photographs. He was looking at the one of Robert, the one from 20 years ago, the work shirt, the squinting against the sun. He did not hear her come in, or if he heard her, he did not turn. She watched him look at the photograph for a moment that stretched longer than looking usually stretched. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of something stopped. "That's Robert," she said. He turned. His face was composed, but there was something behind the composition, something that she could not name with precision, but that she recognized as significant. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You knew him." A long pause. Then Nathan Cross shook his head slowly. "Not to know him. No." He looked back at the photograph for one more moment, then set it down. "He looks like a good man." "He was," Dorothy said. "He left that morning before 8 as the first customers began arriving. He left an envelope on the folding table. She put it on the shelf without opening it. She would open it later and find not money as she had assumed, but a plain card in clear block letters with a phone number and 3 words, "In case." N. Dorothy Dixon put the card in the inside pocket of her cardigan and went back out to the front and said good morning to Agnes Whitmore, who brought 4 loads every Wednesday like clockwork, and she began her day. She did not think about why Nathan Cross had looked at the photograph of Robert the way he had. She put the observation in the particular internal drawer where she kept things she had not yet sorted, and she turned the key and she went on. 2 weeks later, Terrence Briggs came to see her about the property. She had heard the name. In a town of 11,000, certain names circulated with the efficiency of water through a watershed. They went everywhere eventually, and the places they concentrated told you something about the terrain. Terrence Briggs was a contractor, or had been. He was now primarily a developer, which meant he bought property cheaply and sold it expensively and generated the kind of civic friction that small-town developers generated, which was substantial. He had been responsible for the Millhaven Commons project on the north end of town, which had displaced 3 businesses and 2 families and produced a strip of retail space that was 40% vacant after 2 years. He came on a Thursday afternoon with a young man in a good suit who carried a leather portfolio and said very little. Briggs himself was 62, thick through the chest and neck, with the practiced joviality of a man who had learned early that a certain kind of warmth was a useful business tool. He smiled when he came through the door, and he commented on the weather, and he said he understood Dorothy had owned this property for 11 years, which was a long time, and she had done a wonderful job with it, just wonderful. Dorothy dried her hands on a shop towel and looked at him with attention. He got to the number after about 4 minutes of preamble. It was $147,000 for a property that the county assessed at $241,000, and that she had been offered $195,000 for 3 years ago by a developer out of Akron, an offer she had declined because she was not interested in selling. "I'm not interested in selling," she said now. Briggs's smile did not change. This was a thing she noticed about it. It was a smile that did not change in response to information, which meant it was not a responsive smile, but a performed one. "Mrs. Dixon, I completely understand, but I wonder if you've given thought to the long-term viability of a retail operation on this stretch of Clement. The city's been looking at rezoning this corridor for light industrial, which would affect the foot traffic significantly. I'll take my chances." He left his card. The young man set a packet of papers on the counter, and they went out into the Thursday afternoon. Dorothy looked at the packet of papers. She did not touch them. She went to the back room and called Linda Weaver, who had owned the general store on the corner of Clement and Mason for 30 years, and who knew everything that was worth knowing about Millhaven in the way that corner store owners knew things, which was comprehensively. "Briggs came to see you," Linda said. It was not a question. "This afternoon. He's been through the whole South End. Dale Huckabee at the print shop sold. The Nguyen's at the alterations place said no, and they had a break-in the following weekend, though nothing was taken." A pause. "Mitch Garber at the dry cleaner said no twice. His furnace failed in both his units 2 months after. Inspector said electrical issue." "What does he want with the South End distribution hub?" "Somebody out of Pittsburgh is backing him, logistics company, the kind that needs big flat parcels close to the interstate. He's been buying up everything he can on both sides of Clement between 3rd and 9th. Another pause. "There's a rumor the Planning Commission is going to reclassify the zoning. Alderman Pruitt is on record supporting it." Pruitt was at the Millhaven Commons groundbreaking, Dorothy said. In the photographs. I noticed that too, Linda said. After she hung up, Dorothy sat at the back table and thought about the property. The laundromat occupied a building that had been a hardware store, and before that, a feed supply. And before that, though, she had not known this when she bought it, had been the first post office in what became Millhaven, Ohio, in 1887. She knew this because Robert had looked it up. He had been interested in the history of places the way some men were interested in the genealogy of things, tracking the lines of belonging back to their origins. She did not intend to sell. She was not sure at that moment how she would prevent Briggs from getting what he wanted through other means. But she was 74 years old and had been a nurse in a city that had spent 40 years losing everything that had given it identity and purpose. And she had watched what happened when people decided not to fight because the fight looked too expensive or too hard or too pointless. And she had no intention of being one of those people. Not here. Not for this. She took the packet of papers from the counter and sat down and began to read. It took her 2 hours. The papers were dense with a particular thickness of legal language which had been designed primarily to make the people reading it feel that they were not equipped to understand it and should defer to those who claimed they were. She was equipped. She had read 30 years of medical documentation in which the stakes were also high and the language had also been technical. And she had learned early that technical language, however impenetrable it appeared, was always translating a small number of simple facts into complex cover. The simple fact here was this: there was a reference buried in the third section to a municipal ordinance regarding commercial properties that had been cited in a zoning variance proceeding in 2019. The variance involved properties with certain historical use classifications in the Clement Street corridor. And the 2019 proceeding had included as an exhibit a title search that referenced a deed transfer from 1994, the year Dorothy and Robert had purchased the building that contained a restriction clause about commercial use changes. Dorothy read the clause 3 times. Then she went to the filing cabinet where she kept the property documents and pulled the original deed. The restriction was there. It was something that had been inserted by the previous owner, a hardware man named Vernon Strauss, who had been by all accounts a difficult person with strong feelings about how the building should be used in perpetuity. The restriction stated that the property could not be converted to warehouse or distribution use without the unanimous consent of the adjacent property owners on both sides. She looked at the names of the adjacent properties in 1994. Both had changed hands multiple times. She looked at who owned them now. On one side, a property company registered in Delaware with no visible Ohio principals. On the other side, a property company registered in Delaware with no visible Ohio principals. She sat with that for a while. Then she went to the shelf and looked at the photograph of Robert. "You're going to tell me I'm being paranoid," she said to him. "You always said I was systematic to a fault." Robert Dixon looked back at her from 20 years ago, squinting into the sun, not quite smiling. "I know," she said. "I know. But I want to see how far this goes before I decide what to do about it." She put the deed back in the filing cabinet. She pulled the small notebook from her pocket and began to write down what she knew and what she needed to find out. The list got long before she stopped. Outside on Clement Street, the November dark came down early the way it always did in this part of Ohio, pressing in from the east before 4 o'clock, filling the gaps between the buildings with a cold that had no opinion about what it touched. Dorothy Dixon sat at the folding table in Millhaven Wash and Fold and wrote in her notebook and made plans, and the laundromat hummed and clicked around her with the sounds of its working, which were the sounds of her life, which were the sounds of a woman who had not yet been persuaded that the fight was not worth having. She had been persuaded of very few things against her will in 74 years. She did not intend to start now. The weeks that followed were instructive. Dorothy was a precise woman, and precision she had found was the most useful tool available to a person who had limited resources and significant opposition. She did not have money in the way that Terrence Briggs had money. She did not have legal counsel on retainer. She did not have the particular kind of influence that moved through planning commissions and aldermen's offices and the back rooms of civic organizations like Water Through Pipes, directed and invisible. What she had was 30 years of nursing, which had taught her to document everything, to read the record accurately, and to understand that the difference between a situation that could be fixed and one that could not was usually a matter of what information was available and who had access to it. She began attending city council meetings. She had not attended one in 11 years of owning the property on Clement Street, and she discovered that they were poorly attended, held in a room in the municipal building that smelled of institutional carpet, and held an audience on most nights of fewer than 20 people, mostly the same 20 people who attended everything in Millhaven. She sat in the back row and took notes. She also talked to her neighbors on Clement Street, not just Linda. Dale Huckabee, who had sold his print shop to Briggs and now expressed a specific kind of regret about it, the regret of a man who had made a decision under pressure and had not yet finished living with its consequences. The Nguyen's Lin and Fan, who had run their alteration shop for 18 years and who had a directness about their assessment of what had happened to them that Dorothy found refreshing and clarifying. Old George Mabry, who had operated a shoe repair at the far end of the corridor for 40 years and had received no visit from Briggs, which he attributed to the fact that his building was owned by his church and could not be sold without board approval. He came by once, George said. I told him the property wasn't mine to sell. He asked if I could facilitate a conversation with the board. I told him to facilitate himself right out of my shop. A pause, and then the dry, unhurried laugh of a man who had made peace with his own combativeness. He hasn't been back. Dorothy wrote this down. She also went to the county recorder's office and pulled every property transaction on Clement Street from 2018 to the present. She spread the records out on the folding table in the back room at night and traced the movements of money and ownership with the same methodical attention she had brought to patient charts in 30 years of emergency medicine. The pattern that emerged was not subtle. It was the pattern of a coordinated acquisition. She wrote down the appropriate names for it in her notebook, both the technical one and the plain one. In the second week of December, she arrived at the council meeting to find a new item on the agenda, a first reading of an ordinance that would reclassify the Clement Street corridor south of 5th Street from mixed commercial to light industrial use. The ordinance had been introduced by Alderman Gerald Pruitt. It was moving faster than she had expected. That was the first signal that something was more organized than it appeared. That what looked like municipal process was in fact municipal process being used as a delivery mechanism for a predetermined outcome. She sat in the back row and listened to Pruitt read the ordinance in the flat recitative of a man who had practiced reading something without making it sound like it mattered. And she took notes, and she thought about what she would need to do and how much time she had to do it. In the parking lot afterwards, she called Linda. They're moving fast, she said. Second reading is January 14th, Linda said. That's when public comment opens. I need a lawyer. Can you afford one? Dorothy thought about the card in her cardigan pocket, the one she had been carrying since the morning Nathan Cross had left. The phone number in block letters. In case. She thought about whether calling that number was asking for charity or asking for information, and she had decided over the preceding weeks that those were different things and that she was asking for the second. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to find out. That evening, she dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. Then Nathan Cross's voice, low and even with the particular quality of a man accustomed to receiving calls at hours that other people considered irregular. Dorothy, he said. She had not identified herself. She noted this. I have a situation, she said. I'm not asking for help. I'm asking for information. Do you have time? A brief silence. Yes, he said. Tell me what you know. She told him. All of it, Briggs. The property, the adjacent owner shell companies, Pruitt, the rezoning ordinance, the acquisition pattern. She told him with the same precision she had brought to 30 years of case documentation, nothing omitted, nothing inflated. She heard him listen. He was a good listener. She had noticed that in the 3 days he had been in the laundromat. He did not fill silence with noise or response with noise. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. What do you need? He asked. I need to know if what I'm seeing is what I think it is. And I need to know if there's a way to challenge the rezoning legally that doesn't cost more than I have. Another pause. I'm going to make some calls. I'll get back to you tomorrow. I'm not asking the club for anything, Nathan. You're not asking for anything, he said. I'm offering information. That's different. He called back the next morning at 7:15 while she was opening the shop, and the first load of the day was running in machine 4. The shell companies, he said without preamble, both registered to the same Delaware LLC, which is a subsidiary of a holding company out of Pittsburgh. The holding company has 3 principals listed. One of them is a man named Vincent Calabrese, who has been a business associate of Briggs going back 12 years. A pause. The restriction clause in your deed is real and enforceable. I had a lawyer look at it last night. You had a lawyer look at it last night, Dorothy repeated. He owes me a favor. He's a real estate attorney licensed in Ohio, and his opinion is that the clause is valid and that any attempt to transfer the property to warehouse or distribution use without the consent of both adjacent property owners is legally challengeable. The fact that both adjacent properties are now owned by the same beneficial interest does not constitute independent consent. That was his specific language. Who is the lawyer? His name is Marcus Donovan. He practices out of Youngstown. He went to school with one of our members. He will represent you pro bono if you decide to challenge the rezoning. He does a certain amount of this kind of work. His word is good. I want to talk to him myself, Dorothy said. I expected that. I'll give you his number. He did. She wrote it down. Nathan, she said. Yeah. What do you want from this? The question sat on the line for a moment. She had asked it directly because she was a direct woman, and because she needed to understand the transaction, clearly needed to know what shape it had, what it would cost in the currencies she had available to spend. Nothing you're thinking, he said. Nothing that works like that. Then tell me what it works like. Another pause. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she had noticed in those 3 days, the quality of a man choosing words with the same economy he brought to everything else. There are debts I carry, he said. Some of them are old. Some of them I haven't been able to pay until now. That's what this is. Dorothy looked at the photograph of Robert on the shelf. She thought about the way Nathan Cross had stood in front of it that third morning, the quality of stillness that was not his usual stillness. Old debts, she said. Yes. She let the silence sit for a moment. She was not going to push on it yet. She had spent 50 years knowing when to push and when to wait, and this was a place for waiting. I'll call Marcus Donovan, she said. Thank you. Dorothy. His voice was even, but there was something under it. Be careful. Briggs doesn't get what he wants often enough to have gotten good at losing. She called Marcus Donovan at 8. He was 38 with the particular focused energy of an attorney who had chosen the kind of practice that did not make him wealthy, but apparently gave him something else he needed. He asked intelligent questions and listened without interrupting and told her what he thought could be done and what he thought could not be done with the precision of a man who had learned that hope was not a legal strategy and kindness lay in accuracy rather than reassurance. They arranged a meeting for Friday afternoon. After she hung up, Dorothy sat with the fact that she had made 2 phone calls and was now, it seemed, no longer approaching this situation alone. She thought about how she felt about that. The honest answer was complicated in the way that honest answers about the things you needed were always complicated when you had spent a long time not needing things from other people. Not from choice, exactly not from pride in the simplest sense, but from the accumulated experience of knowing that needing things created obligations, and obligations created entanglements, and entanglements created the possibility of loss. And she had lost Robert 5 years ago, and the loss had been of a magnitude that reorganized everything else. Since then, she had been careful about what she allowed herself to depend on. This was not a new thought. She knew this about herself with the same clarity she knew most things about herself. What was new was the recognition that careful was beginning to look from certain angles less like protection and more like another kind of damage. She went back to work. The iron verdict. MC came to Millhaven Wash and Fold on a Saturday morning in December, 11 days after Nathan Cross had left the shop in the early morning. They came in 2 groups, which was a practical matter. The shop had 20 machines and 12 men who needed their riding gear cleaned, and they arranged themselves with the relaxed efficiency of people who were accustomed to operating in a space and managing the logistics as they went. Dorothy was behind the counter sorting a drop-off order when the first group came through the door, and she recognized Nathan Cross at the center of them, still favoring his left side slightly, which was appropriate for 11 days post-stitching, and behind him a man who was built like something quarried rather than grown. Wide through the shoulders with a gray salted beard that gave him the appearance of a man who had decided around age 40 to stop pretending he was going to look any different and had found the decision settling. Dorothy, Nathan said. Nathan, she set down the shirts. Your timing is good. I have 4 open machines. We've got more than 4 loads. I know, I'm saying start there. She looked at the men behind him. They were looking at her with the particular quality of attention that she recognized, not hostile, not even especially evaluative, but the attention of people who had heard something and were now making up their own minds. She met it straightforwardly because she had never learned any other way to meet it. I'm Dorothy Dixon, she said to the room. I take cash or card detergents, $1.50. Dryers are $1.75 for the first 30 minutes and a quarter for every 10 after that. Machine 2 makes a noise, but it's fine. There was a small ripple through the group. Not quite laughter. Something that was the precursor to it. A man near the back said, Garrett Holden, I run the club. He was the quarried one, wide-shouldered, gray-bearded. He held out a hand and Dorothy shook it. We appreciate the space. You're paying customers, Dorothy said. That's the only appreciation required. They settled in. The shop filled with the particular version of noise that a laundromat produced when it was fully occupied, the running of machines, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clank of zippers against the drum. Dorothy worked through the drop-off orders at the counter and answered the questions that the men who came up to the counter asked. A young man who could not have been more than 27 came up to ask about fabric softener and lingered after she had answered with a slight self-consciousness of someone who wanted to say something else and hadn't decided how. Calvin Roth, he said eventually. Dorothy Dixon. He nodded. He had a frank, open face in the manner of someone who had been raised with enough directness to value it even when it was uncomfortable. Nathan said you patched him up when he got hurt. I did. He looked at her for a moment. Then thank you. He came to my door, Dorothy said simply. I'm a nurse. It's what I know how to do. Still, Calvin said, he didn't have to end up at your door. Could have ended up a lot of other places. A pause. I don't think that was an accident. Dorothy looked at him. What do you mean? Nathan doesn't end up places by accident. He knows this part of Millhaven. He knows the streets. He looked at his hands for a moment. I think he knew it was your place. Dorothy was quiet. She thought about Nathan standing in front of the photograph of Robert the morning of the 3rd day. She thought about the way he had said old debts with the specific weight of a man describing something he had been carrying for a long time. He brought his laundry, she said. That's enough for now. Calvin Roth looked at her for one more moment, then nodded and went back to his machine. Nathan came up to the counter near the end of the morning when the loads were cycling through the dryers and the shop had settled into its midpoint quiet. How are the stitches? Dorothy asked. Coming out fine. Don't pull them yourself. Let a doctor do it. I know a doctor. That's not what I said. Something moved in his face, that same precursor to a smile slightly more present than before. I'll find someone qualified. She leaned on the counter. She had been thinking about what to say, and she had decided that the most efficient path was the direct one, which was her path for most things. You knew it was my place, she said. When you came here hurt, you knew. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, because of Robert. Another pause, then, yes. Tell me. He looked at her for a long time with the assessment quality that she had come to understand was his version of deliberation, the careful internal accounting of a man deciding how much truth the moment required. Then he looked away at the machines at the window, at something past the window. Not here, he said. Not now. But I'll tell you. When? When there's time for it. When this thing with Briggs is settled. She held his gaze. That could be a long time from now. Then I'll wait, he said. I've been waiting 28 years. I can wait a little longer. Dorothy Dixon looked at Nathan Cross and felt the particular quality of weight that came from standing at the edge of something, not knowing its depth, not knowing how long the fall would be, but knowing that the fall had already in some irreversible way begun. All right, she said. She went back to work. Marcus Donovan came to the shop on Friday afternoon after close, and they sat at the folding table with coffee and the property documents spread between them, and he explained in careful sequential terms what the legal landscape looked like. The restriction clause was valid, he confirmed. Any change to warehouse or distribution use required the written consent of both adjacent property owners. Both adjacent properties were now beneficially owned by the same Delaware LLC. Can we establish that? Dorothy asked. Yes. Corporate records are public. It takes work to trace through the subsidiary layers, but it can be done, and I've already begun. He set a document on the table. What we can argue is that the two adjacent properties, because they share a beneficial owner, cannot constitute independent consent. A court would need to rule on this, but I believe we win that argument. What's the timeline? If Briggs attempts to move on the property through the rezoning that changes the use classification of the entire corridor, which significantly weakens your position. The restriction clause governs the property specifically, but a rezoning affects the regulatory environment around it. He tapped the table. I want to challenge the procedural adequacy of the first reading. There are notice requirements. A rezoning of this scale requires public notice in the paper of record at least 14 days prior to first reading. I'm checking whether Briggs and Pruitt shortcut that. Dorothy had checked this too. She pulled her notebook. The notice ran December 3rd. First reading was December 9th, 6 days. Marcus Donovan looked at her for a moment, then looked at the notebook, then looked at her again with the expression of a man recalibrating. You've been thorough. I spent 30 years writing case notes that a doctor's career depended on being accurate, Dorothy said. Old habits. He took out his own notebook. Then we have a procedural challenge. That may not stop the second reading, but it creates a record of irregularity and gives us grounds for appeal if the ordinance passes. I want to file a public comment for the January 14th meeting, and I want you to speak. At the council meeting, yes, public comment is legally required to be entered into the record. It creates a paper trail, and there are things that need to be said in that room by someone who has standing, not a lawyer, not an activist. You, a business owner, a taxpayer, a widow, who has been on Clement Street for 11 years. He paused. People like Briggs and Pruitt operate by keeping things quiet. Light is the best disinfectant, but it has to actually reach the thing. Dorothy thought about standing up in the municipal building in front of Gerald Pruitt and whatever audience the January meeting produced and saying the true things clearly. She was not a woman who experienced stage fright in the way that most people described it. She had stood at bedsides telling people things they did not want to hear for 30 years. But she understood what Donovan was asking, which was not just public comment, but a kind of visibility that she had not sought since Robert died. I'll prepare something, she said. The second week of December brought the first significant snow of the season, not the dusting that had come in November, but real snow, the kind that settled in and meant it covering the south end of Clement Street in the particular quiet that snow produced, muffling the sound of traffic and softening the edges of the buildings, and making Millhaven look for a few hours like something better than it was. Dorothy worked through it. She took informal statements from George Mabry and Linda Weaver, and after a careful conversation at his house on Elmwood Dale Huckabee, who told her that Briggs had first approached him about the property in March of the year before the rezoning proposal, and that Briggs had referred in that first conversation to the city's plans for the corridor in a way that implied prior knowledge of a process that had not yet been made public. She passed this information to Marcus Donovan. She also talked to her son David, who called on Sunday as he always did, and who listened to the situation with the careful attention of a man who had grown up watching his mother be the person who saw things clearly and acted on what she saw. Mom, he said when she was done, are you being careful? I'm being precise, she said, which is better. On the morning of January 8th, 6 days before the council meeting, she was sorting a drop-off order when Nathan came in at 7:20 with 2 cups from the coffee shop on 4th Street, a thing she had not asked for, and that he had apparently decided to do without commentary. And he sat in the folding chair across the counter and said, "I need to tell you something." She set down the shirts. She looked at him. He had the quality she had come to recognize as the particular stillness that preceded a thing he had been carrying. Not anxiety, that was the wrong word. More like the composure of a man who had decided to stop managing a weight and to set it down. "The photograph of Robert," he said. "The one on the shelf." "Yes." I recognized him. He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at it for a moment, then looked up. "Not his name. I didn't know his name until I saw the photograph, but I knew his face." Dorothy said nothing. She waited. 28 years ago, Nathan said. January 1997. I was 24 years old. I was driving a truck on Route 30 outside of New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, in a sleet storm, and the truck went off the road. He paused. I don't remember much about the impact. I remember coming back to consciousness, and the cab was at an angle and there was smoke, and the door on my side wouldn't open. And I remember a man at the window. Dorothy sat down in the chair behind the counter. "He got the door open," Nathan said. "I don't know how. It was bent in the frame. He pulled me out. I couldn't have gotten out on my own. My shoulder was dislocated and my leg was caught. He got me clear." Another pause. 30 seconds later, the cab caught. It burned fast. I was on the shoulder and the man was beside me, and I turned to look at him and he was already walking away. Not running. Walking. Back toward a truck that was parked about 50 yards up the road. He never looked back. The shop was very quiet. Dorothy could hear the sound of the street outside, a car passing, the particular silence of an Ohio January morning. "I never knew his name," Nathan said. "I tried to find out. I called the state police. I called the county. I talked to people who might have seen it. Nobody had anything. It was 1997 in a sleet storm on a stretch of Route 30 that didn't have a lot of traffic." He looked at her steadily. "I spent a long time thinking about that man. What he looked like, why he walked away." "Robert didn't like gratitude," Dorothy said. Her voice came out level, which was something she had to work for. "He said it embarrassed him. He thought doing a thing and then receiving thanks for it made the thing about him instead of about the thing." She stopped. "He would have walked away." "I know," Nathan said. "When I saw the photograph, I knew." He looked at the shelf where the photograph sat. "He died not knowing he saved my life. And you spent 5 years missing him and not knowing he did that." Dorothy looked at the photograph of Robert. The squinting against the sun, the almost smile. The man who brought home stray things and fixed broken things and walked away from fires into sleet storms and back toward his truck without looking back. She felt the quality of weight that she had been carrying since Robert died shift. Not lighten it did not lighten, but change. Become different in its shape, like a thing reorganized. Like a thing that had been incomplete in some way she had not known to notice, and was now in some way she also could not fully articulate complete. "He was 47 years old," she said, "in 1997. He looked like a working man." Nathan paused. "Strong, not the kind of man who made a show of things." "No," Dorothy said. "He never made a show of things." The silence that followed was the kind that does not need to be filled. She had known that kind of silence before with Robert, in the years when they had learned each other well enough that the quiet between them was not empty, but full, containing the accumulated weight of two people who had been paying close attention to each other for a long time. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me. I should have told you before." He looked at his coffee. "I was—" He stopped. "Working up to it," she said. "Yes." She picked up the shirts and went back to sorting. She heard him set down the cup. She heard the sound of his jacket, the soft creak of the folding chair. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Calvin," he said. "Calvin Roth." A pause. "In 2009, I was on Highway 11 outside of Niles in July. A kid on a motorcycle, maybe 19, had gone off the shoulder into the ditch. Single vehicle, no other cars involved. He was conscious, but his bike was on him and he couldn't get it off. I got it off." Dorothy set down the shirts again. She turned to look at him. "I called it in," Nathan said. I stayed until the ambulance came. The kid's name I found out later was Calvin Roth, from Warren. He joined the club 4 years after when he was 23. He paused. He didn't know it was me until about 6 months ago. Dorothy stood at the counter and looked at Nathan Cross and felt something that was not quite any single word she could reach for, but that was in the vicinity of several of them. Simultaneously, the feeling of standing at the center of something that was much larger than it appeared from any single vantage point. Robert had pulled Nathan from a burning truck. Nathan had pulled Calvin from a ditch. Calvin was now the youngest member of Iron Verdict and had been, she thought back to the day of the first laundry visit, the one who had come up to the counter and said thank you, and said, I think he knew it was your place. He had known. Had known because Nathan had told him. Had known because Nathan had come to her door not accidentally, but with the particular purposefulness of a man who has carried a debt for a long time and has finally, after 28 years, found the door it belongs to. A circle, she said. Yes, Nathan said. Robert would have found that very funny, she said. He didn't believe in coincidence, but he had a lot of respect for patterns. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then for the first time, fully and completely, Nathan Cross smiled. It changed his face entirely. She had not expected it because she had cataloged the precursors to it over the past weeks without having seen the thing itself. And the thing itself was very different from the precursor. It was a smile that had been waiting a long time and did not have any performance in it. Just the straight, unguarded fact of it. He sounds like a good man, Nathan said. He was, Dorothy said. He really was. She went back to the shirts, but she kept the smile in the internal space where she kept the things that mattered alongside the weight of missing Robert, alongside the fact of the laundromat and Clement Street and the meeting on January 14th and all of it, and she held it there and she worked. January 14th came cold and clear. The kind of Ohio January day that had no sympathy for the cold and no apology for the clarity, the sky, the color of old ice, and the sun giving light without warmth, in the particular way that was not cruelty, but simply indifference. Dorothy Dixon arrived at the Millhaven Municipal Building at 6:15 for a 7 o'clock meeting. The room held 80 seats. When she arrived, there were 7 people in it, which was 7 more than the previous meeting had started with, and fewer than she had expected. Linda Weaver came at 6:30 with a thermos, and then Wenz and George Mabry. Dale Huckabee came at 6:45 alone in a good coat, with the particular quality of a man who had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. By 6:50, the room had 30 people. Gerald Pruitt arrived at 6:55 and looked at the room with an expression that he managed quickly, but not quickly enough. Dorothy, watching him from the second row, cataloged its surprise, then reassessment, then the closing of the reassessment behind professional composure, which was not quite successful. Terrence Briggs arrived 2 minutes later with his attorney and 2 assistants with laptop bags. He sat in the front row on the right side. He scanned the room with the practiced eye of a man who evaluated rooms before he entered them, and when his scan reached Dorothy, it stopped for a fraction of a second. She looked back at him without expression. The room continued to fill. By 7 o'clock, there were 60 people in the 80-seat room. By 7:10, there were 72. There were people standing along the back wall. Dorothy recognized faces from all over the south end of town, not just Clement Street, but the adjacent blocks, the streets on either side. The neighborhoods that had been watching what was happening on the corridor with the specific attention of people who understood what the movement of money and influence in their direction usually meant. At 7:15, the main door opened and Iron Verdict MC came in. Not all of them. 32 men in leather vests, which was what the room could hold. They came in without sound, arranged themselves along the back wall, in the space the standing people made for them, without being asked, and were still. Calvin Roth was near the center, with a manila folder under his arm. Garrett Holden stood near the door. Nathan Cross stood at the far end of the line close to the wall and looked at the room with the even attention of a man who had decided what he was here for and was not going to be distracted from it. Dorothy did not turn around. She felt the shift in the room the way you felt a temperature change, not in any single sharp moment, but as a gradual alteration of the quality of the air. Briggs's attorney leaned over and said something in a low voice. Pruitt called the meeting to order. The reading of the second ordinance took 8 minutes. It was procedurally unremarkable. The language was the same as the first reading with minor amendments. Pruitt read it in the same flat recitative. Then public comment opened. Marcus Donovan went first, not as Dorothy's attorney, but as a private citizen, an attorney speaking in a private capacity about matters of public record, a distinction he had explained to her that carried weight in the legal record. He was precise and methodical, and he laid out in 12 minutes the acquisition timeline. The email chain that Wendell had located in the public archive of the city's email server, the procedural inadequacy of the notice for the first reading, and the legal weight of the restriction clause in the property deed at 412 Clement Street. He said all of this without inflection, which made it worse for Briggs and Pruitt than any inflection would have. Then Dale Huckabee spoke. He was not a practiced public speaker. His hands shook slightly, and he read from notes. But what he said was simple and clear. He had been approached by Terrence Briggs about the print shop on Clement Street in March of 2022, and Briggs had referred in that conversation to the city's plans for the quarter, which had not been publicly announced until November of 2022. He had documentation of the date of the Briggs meeting in the form of an invoice for a printing job Briggs had placed the same day which he had brought with him. He set the invoice on the council table. Then Lin Nguyen spoke. She was 51 years old and had been in the United States for 23 years and spoke English with a precision that came from someone who had learned a language fully rather than casually. She said that her alterations shop had been operating for 18 years and that she had refused to sell it, and that subsequent to her refusal she had experienced a break-in and a furnace failure, and that she was not asserting that these events were connected to the refusal, but she was asserting that they were events that the council should know about and that the council should ask Mr. Briggs to address. Then George Mabry spoke for 4 minutes about the history of Clement Street and what it had been and what it still was, and what the south end of Millhaven would be if it lost the businesses and the people that had stayed when other parts of the city had not. Then Linda Weaver spoke briefly about the general store and about her 30 years on the corner and about what she had watched happen to the properties around her and about the fact that she had 2 employees and 17 regular families who depended on the store being there. Then Dorothy Dixon stood up. The room was very quiet. She walked to the front and stood at the public comment podium and put her 3 pages in front of her and looked up. She looked at Pruitt, who was watching her with the expression of a man hoping to project neutrality and not quite achieving it. She looked at Briggs, who was watching her with an expression that was less easy to read, which she thought was probably because Briggs was not a stupid man and was currently calculating what the room contained and what it meant. She looked at the 80 people in the seats and the people standing along the walls and the 32 men in leather vests at the back, and she thought about Robert, who had fixed things because they were in front of him and he had the hands for it. She began to read. Her statement covered 6 things in 3 pages. The facts of the property acquisition, the procedural inadequacy of the notice, the weight of the restriction clause, the email chain and what it implied about prior knowledge, the pattern of property coercion she had documented on the corridor, and what she believed this ordinance was and was not about. She read all of it. She did not perform. She read it in the voice of a woman who had been doing precise and important work for 30 years and had learned that the way to honor work was to do it carefully. When she finished the last paragraph, which said that she had owned this property for 11 years and was not going to sell it, not for the offered price, not for the market price, not in response to intimidation or procedural manipulation, or the assumption that a 74-year-old woman running a laundromat was not equipped to understand what was being done to her, that she had been an emergency nurse for 30 years and had been underestimated by better people than Terrence Briggs, and was still here. She stopped and looked up from the pages. The room was very still. Then from the back, one of the iron verdict men began to applaud, and the rest of them followed, and then the room followed, and the applause was not the polite variety, but the sustained, risen variety that happens when a room of people has been feeling something for a while and finally has an appropriate place to put it. Briggs was not applauding. His attorney was writing on a legal pad. Pruitt was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had been fairly certain he knew how the evening would go and was now engaged in a rapid and uncomfortable revision of that certainty. Dorothy Dixon picked up her 3 pages and walked back to her seat. Linda Weaver put a hand on her arm briefly without words. Nathan Cross at the back of the room was not applauding. He was looking at her with the steady, patient attention that she had come to understand was his version of the full and complete version of whatever it was he felt, and she met it for one moment before she turned back to face the front. What came next was Briggs's attorney making a procedural motion and Marcus Donovan countering it, and Pruitt calling a recess that lasted 11 minutes, and during which he consulted with the city attorney in a corner of the room and did not come near the council table. The vote on the second reading was 4-3 against. It passed neither. The quarter study was sent back to committee. 4 days later, the Ohio Attorney General's office announced that it had opened a preliminary inquiry into the property acquisition practices in Millhaven's Clement Street corridor. The announcement was brief and procedural and said very little directly, which was how such announcements usually worked, but what it meant was not procedural. What it meant was that someone had forwarded information to the right office, and the right office had decided it was worth a look. Dorothy heard about it from Marcus Donovan, who called at 8:15 on a Thursday morning while she was opening the shop. "It's not a prosecution," he said carefully. "It's a preliminary inquiry. The difference is significant." "I understand the difference," Dorothy said. "What does it mean practically?" "It means Briggs and Pruitt are now operating under scrutiny that is not local, which means the kind of pressure that works in a small town, the kind where a planning commission or a city attorney feels an obligation to a particular name, becomes significantly less functional." A pause. "It doesn't end anything, but it changes the landscape considerably." Dorothy stood at the counter of the shop with the morning light coming through the front windows and thought about the landscape, about what it had looked like 3 months ago in November when Nathan Cross had appeared on her doorstep and what it looked like now. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "You did the work," he said. "I filed the paperwork. There's a distinction." She thought Robert would have liked Marcus Donovan too. After she hung up, she walked to the shelf and looked at the photograph of Robert. The squinting against the sun, the almost smile, the battered work shirt. "You would have found this very funny," she told him. And the quality of the missing present, always in its permanent home in her chest, shifted again the way it had shifted the morning Nathan Cross told her about Route 30. Became in some way that was not a diminishment, but a deepening part of a larger story than just the story of what she had lost. She turned back to the machines. There was a full house today. The winter passed in increments the way Ohio winters always did. Not a single sustained cold, but a series of retreats and returns, weeks of bitter freeze, followed by a few days of false thaw that felt like a promise and then did not keep it. Dorothy worked through all of it. She had developed over the past weeks a new rhythm in the shop, not different in its practical dimensions. The opening at 7:30, the closing at 7, the Tuesday and Friday drop-off service. The machine maintenance on Sunday mornings, but different in its texture. The quality of being alone in the shop had changed. Not because she was in it less, but because of what she had put into it. The conversations at the folding table, the notebooks on the counter, the early mornings with cold coffee that were operational and useful, and also she had been honest with herself something else. She was not a woman who confused gratitude with other things, or obligation with other things, or proximity under stress with other things. She had been married 41 years to a man she understood with the precision of someone who had paid close attention for a very long time, and she knew the difference between the thing you built over 41 years and the things that were not that thing but were also real, also substantial, also worthy of being named accurately. She was not going to rush this. Nathan came on mornings when the shop was not yet open and left before the first customers arrived. He brought coffee from 4th Street twice more, and after the second time, Dorothy began keeping a better supply of beans in the back room because she did not like being beholden to the logistics of other people's generosity when she could arrange things herself. She told him this. He had said without any particular elaboration, "I know." They had talked in those mornings about many things, about Millhaven and what was happening with the inquiry, about his sister in Pittsburgh, who taught elementary school, and called him on his birthday and Thanksgiving with a precision that suggested she had put it in her calendar 10 years ago and had not revisited the scheduling since. About the club, not in the way that outsiders discuss clubs, with the assumptions and projections that he had told her he had long since stopped being surprised by, but in the way that people discussed the specific communities they had built their lives inside, with a frank acknowledgement of the complications and a clear-eyed account of what the complications were worth. She had told him about the hospital, about what emergency nursing had been in Youngstown in the 1970s and 1980s during the collapse of the steel industry, when the ER had been the only reliably available resource in communities that were losing everything else. About the specific education she had received in those years, in the range of what human beings were capable of in both directions, and how that education had produced in her something that was not cynicism. She had never been able to afford cynicism. It was too expensive. It cost too much attention, but a clarity about what mattered and what did not. Robert said you couldn't shock me, she had told Nathan one morning. He meant it as a compliment. He said that the people he trusted most in emergencies were the ones who had already seen the worst and had decided it didn't change the arithmetic. The arithmetic, Nathan had said. Whether it's worth doing, she said. Whether the thing in front of you is worth the effort. He thought that people who'd been through the worst were better at making that calculation honestly, without optimism getting in the way. Nathan had been quiet for a moment. Then he was right. The inquiry moved slowly in the way that such things moved, with the particular deliberateness of a state-level process that had its own timeline. Briggs's attorney issued a statement that said his client was cooperating fully. Pruitt did not seek reappointment as alderman when his term ended in March. The Corridor Study Committee held 2 meetings and produced no recommendation. Clement Street stayed as it was. Dorothy did not celebrate this exactly because the inquiry was ongoing and the situation was not resolved. But she felt in the measured way she allowed herself to feel things she was not yet fully sure of, a specific quality of satisfaction, the kind that came not from winning, but from having been accurate, from having looked at a situation and understood it correctly and acted on that understanding without requiring the action to produce immediate results. In February, Marcus Donovan called to tell her that the Delaware LLC that owned both adjacent properties had voluntarily dissolved and that the properties had been transferred to a different holding company, one registered in Ohio with named principals who were not Calabrese or anyone connected to Briggs. He did not know what the transfer meant and did not speculate, but he said it was notable. Dorothy looked at the property records herself, the way she looked at everything herself, and made a note in the notebook. The following Saturday, Calvin Roth came into the shop during business hours, the first time he had come alone without the club. He was carrying a cardboard box. Nathan asked me to drop this off, he said, setting it on the counter. It's a boiler part. He said the one you have is original to the building, and it's going to fail in the next cold snap. Dorothy looked at the box. How does he know what boiler I have? He looked at it the last time he was here. He knows boilers. She opened the box and examined the part. It was the right part, she could see that. Tell him I'll pay for it, she said. Calvin Roth looked at her with the frank, open quality of his face. He'll say you won't. Then tell him I'll look for a way to compensate him for it that he can't argue with. Calvin smiled. I'll tell him that. He lingered at the counter. Did he tell you about Route 30 and about me? Yes. Calvin nodded. He looked at his hands on the counter, then looked up. I didn't know it was him who pulled me out of the ditch until last summer. He never said anything. 6 years in the club, and I didn't know. A pause. When he told me, I asked him why he never mentioned it. He said because it didn't need mentioning. That doing a thing and then using it as a currency was a different kind of thing. He looked at her. I think about that a lot. Dorothy thought about Robert walking away from a burning truck into a sleet storm on Route 30, Pennsylvania in 1997 without looking back. Your club president, she said. Garrett? Yeah. Does he know about all of it? Yes. Calvin's expression shifted slightly. I think that's part of why the club came to the meeting the way they did. It wasn't just about Clement Street, though it was also about that. It was about Nathan. He doesn't ask for things. In 26 years, this is the first time I've seen him ask. Dorothy held this information in the particular internal space she used for things that required more time to fully understand. How did you find out about Robert, about who he was? Nathan told me, after he told me about the ditch. Calvin paused. He said that the man who had saved his life was the husband of a woman who had saved his life a second time 28 years later, and that he had been waiting a long time to find a way to tell her that. Dorothy looked at the boiler part in the box on the counter. She thought about Robert, who had fixed things, who had driven away from a burning truck in a sleet storm and gone to work the next morning and not said anything about it because saying something would have made it about him. "Tell him thank you for the part," she said, "and tell him he's welcome to coffee on Thursday morning if he wants it." Calvin Roth picked up the empty box and smiled again, a quick, unguarded smile. "I'll tell him." He left. Dorothy looked at the photograph of Robert on the shelf. "You would have been insufferable about this," she said. "You would have said I told you so for at least a month." Robert Dixon looked back at her from 20 years ago, not quite smiling, squinting into the sun. She went back to work. The spring came in slow. The way springs came in Ohio, reluctantly and with persistent reversions to cold, the forsythia appearing along the back fences in late March, and then being covered in snow in the first week of April, as if the winter were making a final argument. But by the third week of April, the argument was over, and the particular green of an Ohio spring was on the hill behind Clement Street, and the air through the open front door of the shop carried the smell of wet ground and new things. Dorothy had been thinking about something for 3 weeks. She thought about most important things for at least that long before she said them, because she had learned over 74 years that the impulse to speak and the right time to speak were usually not the same moment, and that patience in speech was a form of respect for both the thing being said and the person being said it to. Nathan came on Thursday morning in late April, as he had been coming on Thursday mornings for 3 months. He brought coffee from 4th Street. She had, as usual, already made some, and as usual, she accepted his without making a comment about this, because she had decided that the making of coffee was a language some people spoke, and she was not going to translate it when the translation was unnecessary. They sat at the folding table. Through the front window, Clement Street was quiet in the early morning, the first light catching the wet pavement from last night's rain, everything sharp and present in the April way. "Marcus called yesterday," she said. "The inquiry is likely to result in a formal referral. He thinks Briggs is going to face criminal charges, not just civil exposure." "I heard," Nathan said. "Pruitt retains separate counsel." "Also heard." She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the table. "I've been thinking about something." He waited. "The boiler part," she said. "I looked up the price. It's not inexpensive." "Dorothy, I told you I'd find a way to compensate that you couldn't argue with." She looked at him. "I want you to come to dinner. At my house, on Garfield. I'm a competent cook. Not exceptional, but competent. I thought Sunday." She paused. "I'm not asking the club, I'm asking you." He was quiet. Nathan Cross held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with the steady, patient quality that she had spent 4 months learning to read correctly. She was reasonably confident in her reading of it now, though she would not have claimed certainty. Certainty was a different threshold, and she was not there yet. She was also not going to pretend she was further from it than she was, because pretending was its own kind of damage. "Sunday," he said. 7 o'clock, I'll text you the address." "I know the address," he said. "I've driven past it." She looked at him. "Not in a concerning way," he said. "Just I know the street." "Nathan," Dorothy said with the tone she had developed over 41 years of marriage for occasions when Robert was doing the thing where he was trying to manage an impression and not quite succeeding. "Just say yes." Something in his face relaxed. The thing that was not quite a smile then, the thing that was. "Yes," he said. She went back to her coffee. Sunday came in with the kind of April evening that Ohio produced occasionally as a reminder of what the rest of the year was working toward: the air warm and specific, the late light going gold over the hill, The lilac bush by the front gate on Garfield that Robert had planted in 2003, and that was going to bloom in the next week if the weather held. Dorothy made pot roast because it was what she cooked when she wanted to cook something that required attention and produced a result she was confident in, and because the house needed to smell like something was happening in it. She had not had a dinner guest in 18 months. Nathan arrived at 7:02 on foot, which she had not expected. He had left the motorcycle at the shop and walked the 8 minutes from Clement Street, and she understood that this was a deliberate choice and did not comment on it. She let him in, and he came into the house with the same quality he brought to the laundromat, not claiming the space, but also not being diminished by it, occupying it as a guest who had been invited and who understood the nature of an invitation. He stopped in the hallway and looked at the photographs on the wall. She had a lot of photographs, 30 years of a marriage and 2 children, and a life that had been photographed at its important occasions and its unimportant ones, because Robert had liked cameras, and she had tolerated his liking of them with the affectionate resignation of a woman who has long since accepted the small, endearing idiosyncrasies of the person she has married. Nathan looked at them in the particular way he looked at things, with full attention, methodically from left to right. She let him look. "This one," he said, stopping at a photograph near the end. "How old is he here?" She looked. It was Robert at 40, maybe 41, standing on the porch of the house on Garfield at some summer gathering, holding a bottle of beer and squinting into the sun. He looked younger than she remembered him, which was the particular way of photographs they preserve versions of people that the people themselves had long since moved past. "About 40, she said, "give or take." Nathan nodded. He looked at it for another moment, then followed her to the kitchen. They ate at the kitchen table. She had set it properly. She was a woman who set a table properly when someone was coming for dinner, because her mother had taught her this, and she had never found a reason to revise the teaching. The pot roast was good. She knew it was good because she had made it many times, and this version was no worse than the usual. He ate without ceremony and with the same focused attention she had observed in the laundromat. The concentrated engagement of someone for whom a meal was a thing to be present for. They talked. She told him about David and Patricia, her son in Columbus, and her daughter in Seattle, and the specific ways they were each like Robert and unlike her, and the specific ways they were each like her and unlike Robert. And he listened with the quality of someone who understood that what people said about their children was usually a way of saying something about themselves. He told her about the club, not the mythology of it, not the public version that existed in the imagination of people who had not been inside it, but the actual texture of 26 years inside a community that had its own rules and its own language and its own way of accounting for what people owed each other and what they didn't. He told her about Garrett, who had been president for 14 years and who ran the club the way a good foreman ran a shop, with the understanding that the work was collective and the results were collective and the failures were collective too. He told her about Calvin and about the specific quality of the relationship between them, that the events of last summer had changed, not damaged, but deepened, given a dimension that it had not had before. He cried, Nathan said, when I told him. About his motorcycle, about the ditch. He's 27 years old and he cried in the middle of the parking lot at the shop. A pause. I didn't know what to do with that. What did you do? I stood there, he said. I didn't know what else to do. Then he said, thank you, and I said, you're welcome, and then we both went back to what we were doing. Dorothy looked at him. That was the right thing. Yeah? Yes, sometimes people need to say the thing and have it received, that's all. You didn't try to make it smaller or larger than it was. That was the right thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then Robert would have understood that. He would have. He was very good at receiving things. Better than I am, if I'm honest. I tend to deflect. He used to tell me that deflecting was just another form of not letting people in. Was he right? Usually. She set down her fork. Not always. Sometimes deflecting is accurate. You've assessed correctly that a thing being offered is not the thing it presents as. But when you're deflecting things that are genuine, then he was right. It's not protection, it's just distance. Nathan looked at her across the kitchen table with the quality she had learned to receive without deflecting, the full patient, complete version of it. I drove past this house, he said, 6 or 7 times before I ended up on your doorstep. In November, before I got hurt. He paused. I knew your address from the property records. I knew the laundromat was yours. I kept driving past and not stopping. Why? Because I didn't know what I was going to say. Another pause. I still don't exactly. I know what happened on Route 30. I know what your husband did. I know what it meant. But I don't know how you say that to a person. What the right form is. Dorothy thought about this for a moment. There isn't a right form, she said. There's just saying it or not saying it. You said it. That was the right form. He looked at her for another long moment. Thank you for this. For dinner. You're paying for the boiler part, she said. It's the least I could do. He smiled again, the full one. I'm going to keep bringing coffee. I'm going to keep making my own. I know. She poured more coffee and they sat in the kitchen of the house on Garfield Avenue, with the spring evening settling in outside the window and the lilac bush beginning to push toward bloom and the photographs of Robert on the hallway wall and the good weight of the evening around them, and they talked until 10 o'clock. She walked him to the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the photographs again. Same time next Sunday, he said. Dorothy looked at him. She thought about what the correct answer was and found to no particular surprise that she already knew what it was. Yes, she said. He walked down the porch steps into the April evening. The lilac bush was just perceptible in the dark, a shape the beginning of a smell. Dorothy stood in the doorway and watched him walk up Garfield Avenue and turn toward Clement Street. She went back inside. She stood for a moment in the hallway and looked at the photographs of Robert, the long row of them from left to right. The young man at the beginning, the middle years in the middle. The man at the end who had not known he was going to be at the end. Next Sunday, she told him. She turned off the hallway light and went upstairs. The inquiry produced formal criminal charges against Terrence Briggs in the third week of May, 3 counts of bribery, 2 counts of conspiracy and a commercial fraud, 1 count related to the property acquisition process. Gerald Pruitt was charged separately with 2 counts of official misconduct and 1 count of bribery. Both were scheduled for arraignment in June. Marcus Donovan called her the morning the charges were announced. It's a good day for Clement Street, he said. It's an adequate day, Dorothy said. We'll see how the trial goes. He laughed. She had not expected him to laugh, and it surprised her, and then she thought that she was starting to understand that being surprised was not a bad thing. That it was, in fact, a sign that the world was still capable of being larger than what you expected. She put the phone down and looked at the shop. Machine 4 was running a full load the Hendersons, who brought 6 loads every other Thursday. Machine 7 was running Agnes Whitmore's 4 loads, which Agnes had been bringing every Wednesday for 9 years. Outside on Clement Street, Linda Weaver's general store was open, and the Nguyen's alteration shop was open, and George Mabry's shoe repair was open, and the south end of Millhaven looked in the May morning light like something that had decided to stay. Garrett Holden came in at noon, not with the club alone. He sat at the folding table with the particular settled quality of a man with time and something to say, and Dorothy brought 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. Nathan doesn't know I'm here, he said. I assumed. Garrett wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment. I've known Nathan Cross for 22 years, he said. In 22 years, I've seen him make a decision about something that wasn't operational maybe 3 times. And by operational, I mean not about the club, not about a problem that needed fixing, just about himself. He paused. This is one of those times. Dorothy said nothing. She was listening. He's a good man, Garrett said. That might be the simplest version of what I'm trying to say. He's complicated in the ways that people who've had a hard youth are complicated. He's private in ways that have occasionally been difficult. But the core of him is he does what he said he would do, and he doesn't say things he doesn't mean, and when he's wrong, he says so. He looked up. You know all of this already. Some of it, Dorothy said. I'm here because he is not going to say any of it directly. That's not how he works, and I thought someone should. Garrett picked up his cup. Also, and I mean this in the best possible sense, we're all a little invested at this point. After January 14th, you're something of a figure in the club. Dorothy looked at him. A figure. The woman who stood up at the municipal building and read 3 pages of facts at Briggs while 32 of us were standing at the back of the room. He smiled. Calvin has talked about it approximately 27 times. She thought about that evening, about standing at the podium and reading her statement with the room full, in the iron verdict behind her, and the true things in front of her, and about what it had felt like, not frightening, not difficult in the way she had expected, simply necessary, the right thing to do because it was there to be done, and she had the hands for it. Tell me something, Dorothy said. Honestly, I try to be. Does he know why Robert was on Route 30 in 1997? Why he was driving that stretch of Pennsylvania in January? Garrett shook his head. I don't know the whole story. Nathan knows more than I do. Dorothy thought about what she knew. She pulled it up and looked at it with the precision she brought to things that needed to be accurate. January 1997. Robert had been driving long haul for Midwest Aggregate. He had a route that went through western Pennsylvania, through Lawrence County, through the stretch of Route 30 that ran through New Wilmington. She knew this because she still had the logbooks. Robert had kept his hours scrupulously the way good drivers did. And the logbooks from his driving years were in the filing cabinet upstairs. She had never looked at them for this. She thought about looking at them. I'm going to check something, she said. When I know what I have, I'll tell Nathan. Garrett nodded. That's between you and him. He stood up. I just wanted you to know from someone who doesn't have a personal stake in it, in the way he does, that what's happening is good. For him. A pause. And I don't imagine it's bad for you either. Dorothy looked at Garrett Holden, president of Iron Verdict MC, who had driven his club to a city council meeting in January because a 74-year-old laundromat owner had needed witnesses and who had come alone in May to say what needed to be said on behalf of a man who would not say it himself. No, she said, it's not bad for me. He left. She closed the shop at 7, went to the filing cabinet upstairs, and looked through the logbooks from Robert's driving years. January 1997, Route 30, Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. She found the entry, January 8, 1997. Pittsburgh run return leg weather delay. Route 30 westbound at 14:30. She looked at the entry for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and texted Nathan Cross. I have something to tell you. Thursday. The reply came in 2 minutes. Yes. She put down the phone and stood at the window of the upstairs bedroom looking out at the April yard at the lilac bush, which had fully opened now in the warmth of the past week and was giving off the particular smell that May produced, insistent and brief and specific to itself. January 8th, she said to the room. You were on your way back from Pittsburgh on a Wednesday. Robert didn't answer. He never did, which was the permanent and irrevocable fact of it, the fact she had been living with for 5 years and would live with for the rest of her life. But the room around her had the quality it sometimes had of presence, of accumulated decades of two people in the same space, of a life that was gone but was also indelibly here in the walls and the floors and the smell of the place. She stood there for a while. Then she went downstairs and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with it. And outside the window, the May evening settled in, and the lilac smell came through the glass. And Dorothy Dixon thought about the specific and unlikely geography of the things she had been given. The story she had not known the circle. She had not seen the people who had arrived at her door in November and had been, it turned out, connected to her in ways she had not guessed and was only now beginning to understand. She thought this is the kind of thing Robert would have fixed if it were broken, would have brought home if it were lost, would have stayed with if it needed staying with. She picked up her tea. She looked at the kitchen table, which was the same table she and Robert had eaten at for 30 years. It looked the same as it always had. It also looked, she thought, like a table that was expecting to be used more fully. She sat with that thought for a while and found that it did not make her sad. It made her something else, something that was not hope, not yet, but was what came before hope, the particular state of a mind that has left the door unlocked. She finished her tea and went to bed. Thursday came clear and warm, the May sun doing what May suns did in Ohio when they chose to filling the streets with the particular quality of light that made even the tired parts of working towns look temporarily like something else. Dorothy was behind the counter when Nathan arrived at 7:18. He came in the way he always came in now, not with the careful quality of a man navigating unknown terrain, but with the ease of someone who knew the room and knew his place in it. She had the logbook on the counter. He saw it when he came in. He looked at it, then looked at her. January 8th, 1997, she said. He was on Route 30 westbound at 2:30 in the afternoon. Coming back from Pittsburgh, he would have been passing through New Wilmington in the mid-afternoon. She looked at him steadily. What time did the truck go off the road? Nathan put his coffee down on the folding table. He stood very still for a moment, that stop quality, the one she had first seen in front of Robert's photograph. Around 3, he said. The light was going, not dark yet, but going. He was on time, Dorothy said. If anything, he ran a little early on the Pittsburgh runs. He would have been through New Wilmington by 3. The shop was quiet, a machine running at the end of the row, the street outside just beginning to produce sound. He was supposed to be home by 6, Dorothy said. He came in at 6:40. I remember because I had dinner on and I'd assumed he was delayed by the weather. He said there had been a slick stretch on 30. He didn't say anything else. She paused. He never said anything else. Nathan picked up the coffee and held it without drinking it. He just said slick stretch. Yes. Dorothy looked at the logbook. He didn't lie. He just didn't say the rest of it, which was entirely consistent with how he operated. She closed the logbook and set it on the shelf beside the photograph. He was 40 minutes late because he pulled you out of a burning truck. The silence that followed had the quality of something completing a shape arriving at its edges, a circuit closing. She felt it, and she thought Nathan felt it too, in the particular way that two people feel the same thing at the same time without either of them moving toward describing it. He was 40 minutes late, Nathan said finally. He had slick roads on the way back. He came home. He looked at the logbook on the shelf. He came home and didn't say what happened. No. And you didn't know. I didn't know. She paused. For 28 years, I didn't know. And then you appeared on my threshold in November, and I still didn't know, and then you told me, and I knew. She looked at him. And now I have the logbook entry, January 8th, 1997, Route 30 westbound, which is not proof of anything technically, but it's enough. Nathan Cross set down the coffee cup. He looked at her across the counter of Millhaven Wash and Fold in the May morning, in the light coming through the front window that fell across the rows of machines and the folding tables and the shelf with the logbook and the photograph of Robert. Thank you, he said, for looking. It was there to look at, she said. I just hadn't looked yet. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, can I ask you something? Yes. How are you not about the case, not about Clement Street? Just how are you? She considered the question with the seriousness she gave it. It was a question she was not often asked, and not often asked honestly, which was different from the social version of the question that served as a greeting and expected a one-word answer. Better, she said, than November. She paused. Than most of the last 5 years, if I'm being precise about it. She looked at him. I had gotten quite skilled at being alone. I thought that was the same as being fine. It turned out it wasn't. Nathan was quiet. He had the quality of someone who had heard what she said and was going to let it have its full weight. Are you fine? She asked. The question was fair to return. Something moved in his face. Getting there, he said. Getting there is honest, she said. She made coffee. They sat at the folding table and drank it, and the shop came to life around them as 7:30 came, and Agnes Whitmore arrived with her 4 loads as reliably as she always did. And the day began in its usual way, and Nathan Cross stayed until 9, and then left for the shop that he and 2 other members ran on the east side of town. Dorothy Dixon worked through the morning with the particular quality that had been in the shop since November. The quality of a life that was, against all odds and against several years of evidence to the contrary, still opening, still finding new rooms in itself, still capable of being surprised by what it contained. She thought about what Garrett had said, that it was good, that he had known Nathan for 22 years, and it was good. She thought about what Calvin had said, that Nathan didn't end up at places by accident. She thought about Robert, who had been 40 minutes late on January 8th, 1997, and had come home and not said anything except slick stretch on 30, and had eaten his dinner and watched the news and gone to bed and gotten up the next morning and gone to work. Who had been the kind of man who did the thing and did not require the thing to become a story about him? She had been married to that man for 41 years, and had it turned out not known all of the things he had done, not because he hid them, because he did not keep accounts, because the accounting, the tracking, the expectation of return was not the point. She understood Nathan Cross in this respect. She had understood him, she thought, from the first morning when he had said, "Some of them come because I asked." She had recognized the grammar of it, the grammar of people for whom doing a thing and receiving credit for it were not the same thing and did not need to be. She had been married to that grammar for 41 years. She was not confused about what she felt. She was taking her time with it because taking her time was the right pace for things that mattered, and because she was 74 years old and had no interest in doing things at the wrong pace, just because the right pace looked slow from the outside. But she was not confused. Sunday dinners became a thing. Not every Sunday, some Sundays there were club obligations or family obligations, or the simple logistics of 2 people with their own lives who were finding the shape of time together without either of them being in a hurry about it. But often enough that by June it had the quality of a pattern which was different from the quality of a plan. He brought wine, once good wine, a red from a small producer in southern Ohio, that a club member had apparently recommended. She had 1 glass and said it was good, and he said he was glad. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about many things. He was not a man who talked more than the situation required, but he was not a man who talked less than it required either, which was a different and more difficult quality. He said things that were true and that he had thought about and that landed the way considered true. Things landed with weight, with precision, with the particular resonance of a word in exactly the right place. She told him about Patricia, her daughter in Seattle, who called when she remembered and had a life that was full in the way that Dorothy had always wanted for her children's lives, but who had the quality of someone who had moved very far from her starting point and had not entirely finished deciding what to do with the distance. They talked about this in the way of 2 people who understood complicated family relationships from both sides. Nathan said something about his sister in Pittsburgh, that she was a good person who did not entirely know what to do with him, and that he did not entirely know what to do with her, and that they had arrived at an arrangement that was not close but was also not absent, and that he had made his peace with it. Dorothy said she thought there was something to be said for arrangements that were not close but were not absent, that there was a whole landscape of human relationship between the poles of intimacy and estrangement, and that much of it was livable and good. Nathan said he was coming to believe that. She heard what he meant by it. She let it stand there in the kitchen and have its weight and did not move to manage it or redirect it or make it smaller. In July, he asked if she wanted to go for a ride. She had not been on a motorcycle since 1978, which she told him when she and Robert had briefly known a couple who owned bikes and who had taken them out on a Sunday that fall, and which had produced the particular quality of experience that she had never quite found elsewhere. The specific combination of open road and speed and the particular sensory engagement of being in the landscape, rather than separated from it by glass. She had told Robert she wanted one. He had looked at her the way he looked at things he thought were a bad idea, but that he was not going to argue against, because he knew arguing against things she had decided was a form of energy expenditure that would not produce the desired result. They had not gotten one. Life had intervened: the children, the house, the work. Yes, she said. He brought the bike on a Saturday morning, not the one she had seen before, which was at the shop being serviced, but his own, a touring model, practical and purposeful, in the way of a vehicle that was meant to be ridden and not displayed. He gave her the helmet without preamble and showed her how to get on and how to place her feet, and said that she should hold on, but not tight, that the balance was his and she did not need to manage it, that her job was to be present and let the road be the road. She held his jacket at the sides, and they went out of Millhaven on Route 11 northbound, and the Ohio summer came at her through the open air, the particular warmth of it, the green of the fields on either side, the sky that was an impossible pale blue in the way that the sky in Ohio could be in July, when it chose to be the occasional smell of hay and diesel and the particular clean velocity of moving through the world without a frame around it. She did not think about anything for 45 minutes. She was entirely in the present, which was a state she had not entirely achieved since Robert died. Because since Robert died, there had always been the past in whatever room she was in, and the future in whatever room she was going to, and the present had been a thing she passed through rather than occupied. She was in the present now, completely. When they came back to Millhaven and pulled up in front of the house on Garfield, she sat on the bike for a moment after he stopped the engine. "Again," she said. He turned to look at her, the full smile. "Yes," he said. She got off and handed him the helmet and went inside to start lunch. He followed her up the porch steps and through the door past the photographs of Robert into the kitchen that was her kitchen, and was also increasingly a kitchen where two people sat at the table. She got out bread and a knife and the leftovers from Thursday, and they stood in the kitchen making sandwiches in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have established a rhythm, and the summer light came through the window. And outside, the lilac bush had finished blooming and was just green now, preparing for next year. And Dorothy Dixon stood in her kitchen and was entirely, completely present. That was the summer. In August, Calvin Roth came to the shop with a question. He stood at the counter with a slightly different quality of self-consciousness that indicated the question mattered to him, and he was not sure how to start it. "Say it," Dorothy said. "I'm thinking about going back to school," he said. "Not full-time. Nights. There's a program at Youngstown State in mechanical engineering technology. I've been doing the work for years, I just don't have the credential." He paused. "I know Nathan's talked to you about all of it, about what your husband did, and about the ditch. I thought you should know what I'm going to do with it, with the part of my life I almost didn't get to have." Dorothy looked at him. 27 years old with Robert's Act 3 degrees removed in the chain, a young man who had almost died in a ditch in 2009, and who was standing in her shop in August 14 years later saying he was going back to school. "When does it start?" she asked. "September." "Good," she said. "Let me know how the first semester goes." He nodded. He started to leave, then turned back. "Dorothy." "Calvin. Thank you for all of it. The meeting, the injunction, the shop being here." He paused. "And for the rest." She knew what he meant by the rest. She thought about the chain of it, Robert and Nathan, and the ditch, and the club in November, and the folding table and January 14th, and the Sunday dinners, and the motorcycle, and the summer. She thought about what it looked like from the outside and what it looked like from the inside, and how those were not the same view. "Go to school," she said. "That's the thank you I want." He went. September came, and with it the particular quality of Ohio early fall that was not yet cold, but had the promise of cold in it, the mornings with a bite, the light going golden in the afternoons, the smell of something ending and something beginning in the same breath. Dorothy opened the shop on the first Tuesday of September at 7:30, as she always did, and began the day. Machine 4 was running. Agnes Whitmore's regulars were due at 9. The drop-off box had 2 bags from the weekend, and the folding table had 2 cups of coffee on it, because Nathan Cross had arrived at 7:15, as he sometimes did, and had made himself at home in the way of a man who had decided somewhere in the preceding months that making himself at home was the right thing to do, and who had decided this without particular announcement or ceremony. She came out from the back room and looked at the cups on the folding table, and looked at Nathan in the chair behind it with the paperwork from the inquiry that he was helping her organize, and the particular domestic shape of the morning struck her with sudden clarity. This was what it looked like. Two people, a table coffee work to do the day beginning. Simple, specific, complete. She sat down. She picked up her cup. The Briggs arraignment is November 3rd, Nathan said without looking up from the paperwork. I'll be there, Dorothy said. I know. He turned a page. Marcus wants to do a prep session in October. Go over your testimony. I'll call him. She drank her coffee. Outside on Clement Street, the September morning was filling up with its ordinary sounds. The delivery truck at the general store. The sound of George Mabry raising his front gate at the shoe repair. The particular pattern of traffic on a Tuesday that was different from a Monday and different from a Wednesday in ways so subtle that she could not have articulated them, but that she had after 11 years absorbed. Nathan, she said. He looked up. She thought about what she wanted to say and how to say it with the precision that things that mattered deserved. I'm glad you ended up on my doorstep, she said. In November, whatever the reason. He held her gaze for a moment with the complete patient quality of it. Then so am I. She picked up the drop-off records. The Henderson bag has a note that one of the items is dry clean only. I need to pull it before I run the load. I'll look. They went to work. Outside on Clement Street, the morning moved through its paces with the reliable ordinariness of a place that has decided it is going to be itself. The deliveries and the opening of shops, and the passage of cars, and the particular specific sound of Millhaven, Ohio, in September, which was the sound of a working town that had been through a hard year and had come through it still working. Dorothy Dixon worked through the morning with the particular quality of presence that had been in the shop since November, the quality of a life that was against all odds and against several years of evidence to the contrary still opening, still finding new rooms in itself. She had spent 5 years learning to be alone and had found that it was survivable but not sufficient. She had spent the last 10 months discovering that the insufficient part was addressable and that the addressing of it had taken the form it had taken, which was unusual and specific and not something she would have predicted, and which was also with the precision she brought to everything exactly what it was. She was 74 years old and had been a nurse for 30 years and a widow for 5, and a laundromat owner for 11, and a fighter in her quiet, methodical way when fighting was called for. She had done these things because they were in front of her, and she had the hands for them. She had Robert's hands in this sense, not literally, not in the shape of the fingers or the reach of them, but in the way that mattered, which was the willingness to use them. The understanding that having the capacity to do a thing was its own kind of obligation. That walking away from a thing because it was inconvenient or complicated or scary was a choice, and that it was not the choice she made. The morning opened into afternoon. The afternoon opened into evening. The shop closed at 7. Dorothy turned off the last lights and locked the door and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in front of Millhaven Wash and Fold, looking at the south end of Clement Street in the September dusk. The general store light, the shoe repair dark, the alterations shop dark, the street itself going quiet in the particular early evening way. It was still there. She turned and walked toward Garfield Avenue, and behind her, the sound of a motorcycle starting up in the parking lot 2 doors down, and the sound of it coming alongside her on the empty street, and Nathan Cross's voice even and unhurried. Walk you home. She looked at him. The September evening around them, the light going gold, the smell of the end of summer, the motorcycle idling. It's 8 minutes, she said. I know, he said. She got on. They went down Clement Street and turned onto Mason and turned onto Garfield and pulled up in front of the house with the lilac bush that was finished and green and preparing for next year. And Dorothy got off and handed him the helmet and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house that was her house. Sunday, she said. Sunday, he said. She went up the porch steps. At the door, she turned. He was still there sitting on the bike in the dusk, not moving, not performing anything, just present. Robert, she said, would have asked you about the engine. He had very strong opinions about engines. Nathan Cross looked at her, the full smile. I'll bring the specs, he said. She laughed. It came out full and without warning, the kind of laugh that surprised her with its own uncomplicated completeness, the kind that she had not heard from herself in a long time. It felt like something coming back. She went inside. The Briggs arraignment was on a Thursday in November, the first anniversary, give or take, a few days of Nathan Cross arriving on her doorstep with a knife wound and changing the shape of her life in ways she had not anticipated and could not have planned for. Dorothy drove herself to the courthouse in Millhaven. Marcus Donovan met her in the lobby, precise and prepared as always with his briefcase, in the particular focused energy of a man who had been working toward this morning for a year. They sat together in the gallery. The courtroom filled slowly the way it filled for arraignments, not with the charged atmosphere of a trial, but with the particular businesslike quality of a proceeding that was in legal terms a formality, however weighted its meaning was to the people in it. Briggs came in with his attorney, older now than the photograph she had seen, heavier through the face, with the particular quality of a man who had spent 12 months inside the knowledge of what was coming and had not been improved by the experience. Pruitt's case had been separated. He would face his own proceedings in the new year. She gave her victim impact testimony in the afternoon session as a property owner and as a witness to what she had documented on Clement Street. She read it clearly without inflection. She said the true things. She did not perform. When she came out of the courthouse at 4:15, the November sky was the color of old pewter, and the air had the particular bite of the first genuinely cold day of the month, the kind of cold that announced its intention to stay. Nathan was on the sidewalk. He had not been inside, she had not asked him to be, and he had not offered understanding, as he generally did, the difference between support and presence and the different occasions each of them called for. He was just there, not performing, waiting, not arranged with particular significance, simply standing on the sidewalk outside the courthouse, the way a person stands in a place where they intend to be. "How did it go?" he said. "Accurately," she said. He nodded. They walked to his truck he had driven rather than riding, which was a November concession to practicality that she had been glad of without saying so. She got in, and they drove back to Millhaven in the late afternoon light through the particular Ohio November that had been where all of this started 1 year earlier. The gray sky and the bare trees and the cold that had nothing against you and everything in its nature. She looked at the road. She thought about the year, about what it had been at the beginning and what it was now, and the long distance between the 2 points and the specific things that had covered that distance. The weeks of work, the mornings at the folding table, the meeting in January, the logbook, the motorcycle in July, the Sunday dinners, the laugh on the porch in September that had surprised her with its own completeness. She thought about Robert, who had been 40 minutes late on January 8, 1997, and had come home and eaten his dinner and not said anything about a truck on Route 30, and a young man who would carry the debt of it for 28 years. She thought about how a single act performed without expectation of return and without record could move through the world for decades in ways that the person who performed it never knew and could not have imagined. She thought about what it meant to be the person who finally closed the circle, to be the end of a chain that had begun with Robert and had passed through Nathan and had passed through Calvin and had arrived by the unlikely route of a knife wound in a November night in a laundromat on Clement Street at this truck on this road in this November afternoon. "Nathan," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Thank you for ending up on my doorstep." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you for opening the door." The road went through the fields and the bare trees in the Ohio November. Millhaven came into view at the bottom of the valley, the particular cluster of it, the water tower, the church steeple, the south end of Clement Street visible from the hill. The laundromat was not visible from this angle, but she knew where it was. She knew the town, the way you knew the place. You had decided without quite deciding to stay in. They pulled onto Clement Street at 4:45. She got out in front of the shop. Through the window, the interior was dark and closed, and hers. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," he said. She went inside. She turned on the lights. She stood in the middle of Millhaven Wash and fold the machines, the folding tables, the shelf with Robert's photograph, and the logbook and the card from November. that had contained nothing but a phone number and 3 words. And she looked at the room with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. It was a laundromat. It was also, and had been for the past year, the place where the debt had been paid. Not in money, not in any currency that could be accounted for in a ledger, but in the specific kind of repayment that some debts required presence time, showing up the willingness to be in the room and do the work and stay. She went through the evening procedures methodically, the end-of-day wipe down of the folding tables, the restocking of the detergent dispenser, the check of each machine for forgotten items, the setting of the boiler for overnight. The new boiler part Nathan had sent through Calvin, working quietly in the basement, where it had been for 3 months and would go on working for years. She did all of this in the way she had done it for 11 years, and it felt, as it had been feeling for the past several months, different in its texture without being different in its practice. The same motions, a different quality of being in them. She turned off the light in the back room and left the minimum on in the front, the way she always did. And she locked the door and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in front of Millhaven Wash and Fold, looking at the south end of Clement Street in the November dark. Linda Weaver's general store light was on. George Mabry had gone home. The Nguyen's alteration shop was dark and would open tomorrow as it had opened every day for 18 years, as it would go on opening. The street itself going quiet in the particular early evening way of a November Tuesday. The south end of Millhaven was still here. She walked home. The lilac bush was bare, but it was there, which was what mattered in November. The porch light was on. She had gotten into the habit of leaving it on now, which was a small change in the 11 years of the house, and which was, she understood, not actually about the porch light. She went inside past the photographs of Robert in the hallway into the kitchen, and she put the kettle on and stood at the window and looked out at the yard, in the dark, in the particular quality of November that was its own honest thing, not trying to be anything other than what it was, cold and clear and specific and without apology. She thought about spring, about the lilac bush that would open again in May, about the Sunday dinners and the table and the 2 cups of coffee at 7:15 and the sound of a motorcycle on Garfield Avenue in the September dusk. She thought about Calvin Roth at Youngstown State 2 nights a week, sitting in a classroom with younger students and a credential he had almost never gotten to earn. She thought about Marcus Donovan, who would keep doing the work he had chosen, case by careful case, for people who needed someone who understood the difference between what the law said and what it was for. She thought about Robert, who had fixed things, who had brought home lost things, who had walked away from burning trucks without looking back and come home 40 minutes late and said nothing about it because saying something would have made it about him, and it was not about him. She thought this is what he would have wanted. Not this specifically, he could not have predicted this, but the shape of it. The life continuing, the debt honored, the chain finding its end in the right place. The kettle was ready. She poured her tea and sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth come through. Outside, November settled in with its particular weight, and the house on Garfield held its warmth against it, and Dorothy Dixon sat in the kitchen that Robert had built and thought about the year that had passed and the year that was coming, and found that the thinking was good. The weight in her chest, the permanent weight, the one that had lived there since Robert died, the one that was not grief in the simple sense, but something denser and more structural. The weight of a life that had contained him and now contained his absence was different tonight. Not lighter, she did not want lighter. She had learned in 5 years that lighter was the wrong goal. What she wanted was what she had, a weight that was accompanied now, that had company. That was part of a larger story than just the story of ending. She thought about this laundromat, about the November night a year ago when she had heard the sound on the threshold and had opened the door without quite deciding, to the reflex of a woman who had spent 30 years going toward things that needed to be gone toward. She had opened the door. Everything else had followed from that. She drank her tea in the warm kitchen of the house on Garfield Avenue, and outside the November dark pressed in, and the bare branches of the lilac bush moved in the wind that came down off the hill, and the weight in her chest was present and real and accompanied. And Dorothy Dixon, who was 74 years old and had been a nurse for 30 years and a widow for 5, and a fighter when fighting was called for, sat in the kitchen and was entirely, completely exactly where she was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing. She would open the shop at 7:30 tomorrow, and Agnes Whitmore would come at 9 with her 4 loads, and the Henderson family would bring 6 loads on Thursday, and the machines would run, and Clement Street would be there, and Linda Weaver's General Store would be there, and the Nweens and George Mabry, and the specific sound of a working town that had decided to keep working. And on Sunday, Nathan Cross would come to dinner, and they would sit at the kitchen table and eat a meal she had cooked and talk about the things that two people talked about when they were in the process, without hurry and without performance of deciding to know each other. And outside the window, the November yard would be bare and preparing the way things prepared in November for what came next. She did not know all of what came next. She had never known all of what came next. She was 74 years old, and she had learned in those years that not knowing was not the same as not being ready, and that ready was not the same as certain, and that certain was in any case rarely available, and possibly not worth wanting, because certainty required the future to be finished before it happened, and the future was not finished. And that was the point. She finished her tea. She washed the cup and set it on the rack and turned off the kitchen light. She stood in the hallway for a moment with the photographs of Robert on either side of her, the long years of him from the beginning to the end, all the versions of the man she had known and the man she had not been there for, and the man she was in some new and unexpected way still finding out about. "Good night," she said. She went upstairs. In the morning, she would open the laundromat and begin the work. The machines would run. The street would be itself. And somewhere on the east side of Millhaven, in the shop that smelled of oil and metal and decades of careful work, Nathan Cross would start his own day in the particular way of a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying for 28 years and was learning with the same precision he brought to everything else what it felt like to move without it. They were both in their different ways learning the same thing, that the past was not a debt to be discharged but a foundation to be built on. That the people who came before left things in the world that kept moving after they were gone in ways they could not have tracked and would not have claimed and would not have needed to claim because the claiming was not the point and had never been. Robert Dixon had been 40 minutes late on a January evening in 1997. He had come home and eaten his dinner and not said a word about it, and he had gone on being the man he was for 8 more years until his heart stopped on a Tuesday morning in March, and there was no more time to be that man. But the being of it, the doing of the thing, the capacity to see what needed doing and do it without requiring the doing to be about him, that had not stopped. It had moved outward the way such things move through the people it touched, carrying the shape of itself forward in ways that he had not known and could not have imagined and would not have taken credit for if he had. It was in Nathan Cross, who had pulled a young man out of a ditch on a summer highway because the young man needed pulling out. It was in Calvin Roth, who was sitting in a classroom twice a week at Youngstown State, learning to put the credential around the work he had always known how to do. It was in Dorothy Dixon, who had opened a door at 2 in the morning in November because the door had needed opening and she had the hands for it. It was in the shop on Clement Street. Still there, still running machines, turning and clothes coming clean. 11 years and going on 12 on a street, in a town that had decided not to be quiet about the things that mattered, in the particular stubborn way of people and places that have learned that staying is not passive, but is its own kind of choice made every day renewed against the things that would prefer you weren't there. It was enough. It had always been enough. Dorothy Dixon had simply needed for a year that had changed her completely for someone to help her see it. She slept. Outside on Garfield Avenue, the November wind moved through the branches of the lilac bush and down along the quiet street and out over the south end of Millhaven, past Clement Street and the dark windows of the laundromat and the general store and the alteration shop and the shoe repair, over all the small, persistent working lives of a town that had been asked to disappear and had declined, carrying with it the cold and the dark and the particular quality of a November night in Ohio that was not comfortable and was not warm and was also in its own uncompromising way exactly right. The arraignment proceeded as arraignments proceeded methodically without drama, with the particular compressed formality of a legal process that had been designed to handle large quantities of human consequence in small units of time. Terrence Briggs entered a not guilty plea through his attorney, which was what attorneys advised in arraignments as a matter of standard practice, and the trial date was set for the following April. And the room adjourned with the businesslike efficiency of a process that had many more cases behind it and ahead of it, and did not pause for the weight of any single one. Dorothy Dixon left the courthouse with Marcus Donovan's card in her pocket, and the knowledge that the process was now in motion in a way that could not be stopped by a phone call to the mayor's office or a conversation in the corridor of the Planning Commission. It was in the hands of a system that was imperfect and slow and occasionally unjust, and also, when functioning as it was designed to function, more durable than the particular arrangements of money and influence that Briggs and Pruitt had built their certainties on. She had been a nurse for 30 years. She understood imperfect systems. She had learned that what mattered was not the perfection of the system, but whether you worked it with precision and persistence, whether you documented everything, whether you said the true things clearly and kept saying them, whether you showed up every day at the required hours and did the required work without requiring the work to be comfortable or certain or appreciated in the moment you were doing it. She had done all of those things. She would keep doing them. The weeks that followed the arraignment moved with the cadence of late fall shifting toward winter, the days shortening the light, going amber in the afternoons, and then gone by 5. The particular quality of darkness that Ohio produced in November and December that was different from the darkness of other seasons. Not hostile, but insistent, as if the season were making a point about what mattered and what did not. Dorothy opened the laundromat every morning at 7:30. She closed it every evening at 7. She talked to Marcus Donovan twice a week as the trial preparation began. She talked to Nathan Cross on Thursday mornings and Sunday evenings. She called her son David, who called her on Sundays, and who had come to understand over the past months that his mother was engaged in something that was larger than it appeared from Columbus, and that she was handling it with the particular competence that he had been watching her apply to things his whole life. "Are you happy?" David asked one Sunday in late November. She thought about this with the same seriousness she gave to questions that deserved it. "I think I'm getting there," she said. David was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "Dad would have—" He stopped. "I know," Dorothy said. "I know he would have." She thought about what she had now that she had not had a year ago. Not the trial, not the inquiry, not the legal machinery, grinding slowly toward an outcome that she believed would be just, and that she would believe was just, even if it was not, because the fighting for it had been just, regardless of the outcome. Those things were real, but they were not the things she meant. What she had now was the particular quality of being known. Not entirely, not yet. She was 74 years old, and Nathan Cross was 52. And there was a great deal of each of them that the other had not yet seen, that would take time to see, that might take years, that she was in no hurry to rush through, because rushing through the process of knowing a person was one of the ways you ended up not actually knowing them. But the beginning of it, the first rooms of it, the quality of a Thursday morning when she came out of the back room and there were 2 cups of coffee on the folding table and a man in the chair with the paperwork, and the day felt without requiring anything more from it complete. She had not had that quality in 5 years. She had not expected to have it again. She had, in the way of sensible people who had been through significant loss, been careful about expecting things. Careful was still the right word. She was not reckless, not romantic, not persuaded that the future held any guarantees that the past had not. She was simply, and this was the word she had arrived at, in the kitchen of the house on Garfield on a Tuesday in late November, with the tea cooling and the November dark outside, and the lilac bush bare and ready for spring open. She was open. That was the word. She had been for 5 years closed in the particular way of a person who has sustained a loss that reorganized them, and who has built the reorganization carefully and has been living inside it carefully, protecting its architecture from the weather of new things. And at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, a man had knocked on the door of Millhaven Wash and Fold, and she had opened it, which was what she had done her whole life with things that knocked. And the opening had led to all the rest of it. Not in a straight line, not without difficulty, not without the moments of careful renegotiation that any significant change required from people who were past the age of thinking that significant changes were simple. But open and staying open. On the last Thursday of November, Nathan came with coffee as he always did, and they sat at the folding table as they always did, and after the business of the morning was handled, the trial prep questions she needed to relay to Marcus, the machine at the end of the row that needed a technician before December, the question of whether Agnes Whitmore's increased load reflected a new roommate or a life change of some other kind, which Dorothy had been professionally curious about for 3 weeks. After all of that, Nathan set down his cup and said, "Thanksgiving." She looked at him. "The club does a thing," he said. "Nothing elaborate. Garrett's garage, his wife cooks. Whoever wants to come." He paused. "I wanted to ask if you'd want to come. With me." Dorothy looked at him. She thought about what he was asking, which was not complicated, and was also in the way of uncomplicated things between two people who were in the process of deciding what they were to each other quite significant. She thought about a table in a garage in November, 30 or 40 people, leather vests and the smell of engine oil, and good food in the particular warmth of an enclosed space in the cold. The kind of warmth that came from the number of people in a room rather than from the heating. She thought about Robert, who had always said that you learn the most about people by eating with them. "What time?" she said. Something shifted in Nathan's face, that same easing, that same relaxation of something held tight that she had been watching with increasing fondness for nearly a year. "Noon," he said. "I'll bring something," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm going to. Tell me how many people so I know what size dish." He looked at her for one long moment with the complete patient quality of it, the quality she had spent the year learning to receive without deflecting, and he said 40, maybe 45. "All right," Dorothy Dixon said. "I'll bring the soup." She would make it from scratch. Linda Weaver made it herself from scratch and didn't tell anyone and didn't want to be asked for the recipe. And Dorothy Dixon was the same kind of woman in that respect, the kind who put in what the thing required and did not need the effort to be visible. She would make it the day before the way her mother had made it and her mother's mother before that, the way that things worth making were made, with time and attention and the understanding that the result would be what it was, and that was enough. She would bring it to Garrett's garage on Thanksgiving in November in a town called Millhaven in Ohio, and she would eat at a table with people who had shown up for her when showing up was what the situation required, and she would be someone's guest and someone's presence and someone's something that was still being named, and she would be in all of it entirely herself. 74 years old, a nurse for 30 years, a wife for 41, a widow for 5, a laundromat owner for 11, a fighter when fighting was called for, and a woman who opened doors at 2 in the morning because doors that needed opening were her particular responsibility, had always been her particular responsibility, would always be her particular responsibility as long as she had the hands for it. She picked up the cups and rinsed them in the back sink and set them on the rack. She went out to the front and checked the machines and noted the one that needed the technician and wrote it in her notebook and put the notebook back in her cardigan pocket beside the house key. The shop was running. The street was there. She went back to work.